Thank you. Good afternoon. Apologies again for slightly late. Thank you. Not good at my age, rushing.
Mr. Chairman, before we start, perhaps we'll just be nice to start off by wishing you a happy birthday, I think.
Oh, there you go. Yeah, I've eaten the cake, so yeah. Please, not a song. How embarrassing. Yes, it's not every day you get to 50, 60. Yeah, it's a good star sign though, Gemini. Very honest people, not two-faced, nothing about them. Everything is honest and straightforward. Okay, right. Let's get serious. Okay, right. Good afternoon. GRAC meeting Tuesday, the 14th of June, 2022. Apologies for absence.
Haven't received any apologies for absence.
Lovely, thank you very much. So we don't need any substitutes. Your substitute for Peter Fisher. Thank you. And welcome, Councillor Brown. I presume you're here as an observer at the moment then. Thank you very much. Any public questions? No public questions, thank you. Anybody got any items of urgent business? No, thank you very much. Any declarations of interest you will find on pages 1 to 6 in your papers. You probably know them all off by heart now. Any declarations of interest? Thank you very much. Okay, minutes are the next item. We have 2 sets of minutes to approve. One set of minutes, you will notice, are in purple papers. If anybody wants to discuss the content of those minutes, we will have to go into a private session. If everyone's just happy for us to acknowledge and correct any typos, which I'm sure there aren't any, then we can go ahead. So we'll start first of all then with the agenda item number 6, the minutes of the 8th of March. Mr. Penfold.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I'm just struggling to get my agenda up online here, but from memory, I wasn't recorded as being present at that meeting, but I was present at that meeting. I appear to have asked a question at that meeting, so I think I was there, but I wasn't listed as being there. Thank you.
I will now put you down on my copy. Yes, you have actually mentioned in minutes, so presumably you must have been there. Okay, fine. Front page, any item there? Page 8, page 9, page 10, 11, 12, 13. I think that, can I take them as a true and accurate record? Proposer, please. Councillor Braithwaite, seconder. Councillor Penfold, thank you very much. Then we have the minutes of the meeting that was held on the 22nd of April, 2022. As I say, at the moment, these can be approved. I just need to know if anybody, I'm not going to go through page by page, but if anybody's got any correction or anything they would like to discuss, as I say, we would have to go out of session, but if we're all happy and content with the content of those, can I have a proposer, please? Councillor Braithwaite, seconder, please. Councillor Penfold, we accept them as approved. Thank you very much. Sign those ones as well. Okay, now the fun bits. Let's get these done. Okay, agenda item number 7, the internal audit from the internal auditor, please.
Thank you, Chair. It's the first of 2 reports that I'll present to you today. The first being the final progress report for 21-22. This is where we go through progress in delivering the plan, and I'm pleased to report that As per 3.1 and 3.2, 150 days of programme work has now been completed. It was at times throughout the year tricky to get all of the work done, but we're there. We have achieved it, so I'm very pleased to report that. We have carried one audit through into 22-23, and that is for the environmental charter. I think you received notification of that at the previous meeting when we discussed the plan, so I won't dwell on that point. At 4.4, you can see in the table there how many internal audit reports have been finalised within the last period of the year. We do still have one in draft, but I have no reason to doubt that the assurance grading, the recommendations will be challenged, so that will likely go forward as a final. We're just waiting for a management response, and that was one of the later towards the end of the year. So I think at this point, what we normally do is just have a quick look at Appendix 1, the progress in completing the audit work on page 37, and that gives you a really broad overview of all of the gradings in that year and shows the work to be complete. And then at Appendix 2, starting on page 38, we look at the executive summaries for each of those reports that we've been able to finalise. So we're starting off here with the one limited assurance grading that we gave for North Norfolk District Council in 21-22, and that is for counter fraud and corruption. This piece of work was carried out across the consortium, and we put it in the plan in response to some guidance being issued late 2020, fighting fraud and corruption locally. And that document included a checklist, which we thought would be a very good idea to compare our approach at each council against this checklist to identify any gaps. And it's clear that controls have been strengthened through this review work. And they are actually advocating that the audit committee takes a much more poignant role in looking at counter fraud and corruption arrangements at local authority levels. So what you've got before you here represents the gap analysis. And the results, the limited assurance grading has been issued across the consortium as well. It's not just at North Norfolk where a limited assurance grading has been issued. Wherever we have looked, we have seen gaps. So it's clear that the framework needs improving, and it needs to meet the needs of the increasing risk in this area. If you have a look on page 39, you'll start to see the issues that need to be addressed. And we've got assessment of fraud and corruption risks. We've got resources needing to be reviewed to see whether they need to be bolstered, and then some important recommendations raised there. A little bit later on in the agenda, we do have a fraud policy and fraud risk assessment to go through. So I think those recommendations are certainly underway and have been completed by some of this work later on in the agenda. I'm happy to take any questions at this stage if you want to discuss that report, but there are some others that we can go through as well. Okay, so, sorry, go on.
Have we got any questions so far before we? Christopher, please.
Thank you, Faye. You say there's a risk there. I suppose I've been looking through the papers. Indeed, there's a section on this later on that. What are the precise risks in terms of relation to fraud and corruption that we as a committee need to focus on, and indeed the council?
So as the committee is very high level and strategic, it's not going to be focusing on one particular risk. It's going to be the whole framework for counter fraud and corruption. So all types of risks that councils may be exposed to. Do we have a good policy in place? Is training adequate for members and for officers? And also the investigation processes, are they adequate? You'll be looking at the framework entirely, not just in the specific areas that do pose a risk to council specifically. But I think that the threat, certainly due to COVID and all the issuing of the grants, has kind of put this counter fraud and corruption risk in the centre and allowed us to kind of take a step back and say, you know, are we ready for the increased threat at local government level? Are the resources right? And I think this report reflects that actually some work could be done to make the council more proactive in that space.
Just trying to nail down, obviously, are we just saying we need to sort of review our policy and tighten up procedures, and that will mitigate the risk? Or do you have any examples that you've seen either here or in other councils where actually there's been evidence of fraud, which is sort of motivated what you're effectively where this has come from?
No, it's purely based on the new upgraded guidance, which is the reason for us putting this in. I think it's really interesting to see that the guidance says audit committees should be more active in this area. Some committees I work with do have a regular fraud update and report where they talk about the frauds that have been identified or alleged throughout the year. They talk about some of the Revs and Bens work that they're doing and the National Fraud Initiative. And so the committee has a much more greater understanding of the work that's happening overall, and we don't have that here, and I don't think we have it, you know, for a number of years, and it is the case across some of the other councils as well. So having that report come back and having the committee look at the risks for the council for counter fraud and corruption, and just having that oversight, I think will help with governance over this particular issue.
So I just have one question. On page 38, the limited assurance, which is obviously reflected because of the issues to be addressed. If those issues are to be addressed, were addressed and have been done, would you be comfortable to say that that would have moved up a stage?
Absolutely, and I think we can, you know, we carry out a follow-up process, don't we? So we'll be requesting evidence to show that each of the recommendations we've raised are in fact completed. And I think, as I said, some of the stuff on the agenda today would probably come under that category. But I think, you know, if we carry out consortium-wide, come back and do a follow-up piece to make sure that things have moved in the right direction, then we can say that the threat level and the assurance grading overall, we should see that come down. Yeah, or, you know, in some cases it could be substantial if people have been very proactive and they've got all of those areas from the checklist. Yeah. But we should come back and revisit this either through the follow-up process, but we could also do a separate piece just to give further assurances. Thank you. Okay, so we've got some other reports in here as well. On page 41, you've got the waste management review. A reasonable assurance grading has been given overall with 3 important recommendations raised, and the details are provided there. I don't propose to go into a huge amount of detail about that one because I think it is very easy to understand. We were comforted by the across council working with Breckland. We don't, as an internal audit service, or TIA doesn't provide the internal audit service for Borough, Kings Lynn and West Norfolk, but I have instructed the team to carry out a similar piece of work there, so we can get assurances across the 3. On page 48, we've got the key controls work, and through the important, sorry, have I skipped one? Thank you. Yes, page 45 is the ICT change control and patch management work. And there have been 2 important recommendations raised around, you know, standardising the agreed policies and procedures and making sure that any changes that happen are actually recorded appropriately within the manage engine, which we do have in place and up and running. The key controls work is a piece of work that we carry out every year. And the key findings coming from that, there's a bit of a theme about reconciliations here. So management have agreed to take those forward. I think, you know, obviously through COVID and resources being stretched quite a lot throughout the last 2 years, some of these controls around reconciliations, we have seen a bit of a theme across the consortium of them slipping in terms of their timeliness. But I think it's time for us to get back up to speed with those actually, and make sure that they're done no more than a month after. And then we have the draft assurance review of the environmental charter. Now we don't often, I just wanted to highlight on page 53, raise points for good practice that can be shared across other consortium members, across other councils. But I think we have seen within this review some really good work done around putting the environmental charter together and the strategy, and also approaching independent consultants to actually help guide that work, and we will be sharing those points because I think North Norfolk has worked very hard on that particular piece of work. We would like to see the project board set up and actually provide regular monitoring of the milestones included within that policy. Management had already identified that that would need to take place, but we're just formalising that point with a recommendation that we can follow up on. So I think that's a good one to end on, that actually looking at that strategy overall, it does represent good practice for the councils across Norfolk. So as is usually the case, I'm happy to take any questions that you might have on those individual audits. Thank you very much.
Yes, I will. Just a point on page 43, to right at the top, it's to ensure and obtain regular assurances that Serco complies. Just to make a point of view that there are two committees on that actually overview and scrutiny have made that recommendation first of all. So I think the fact that it's been done by one committee followed by another and then recorded shows that it's really working quite well together. But they certainly had raised it as a very much an issue that they wanted. My final bit is I noticed that with your reports we have no substantial assurances on any of our assessments. Is it a goal that the management should be striving to obtain these, in your opinion?
It's a really tricky one to answer actually, Chair, because I mean, we go by risk-based internal audit approach. So the things that we look at aren't going to be the same every year. We may pick up on areas where they're not as well developed and we're providing a bit more of an advisory role. So you wouldn't expect the control framework there to be as advanced. Yes, absolutely aspire to substantial assurance, but I think, you know, things change all the time, risks change all the time. So whilst reasonable is also a positive assurance grading, I think you can definitely take assurance from that, and it's great to have the substantials, but reasonable is perfectly acceptable.
So if we were to accept that, could we say to ourselves that we're at the top of the reasonable?
I'm sure that's what officers would say, yes.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, can I just ask a question? Really follow.
Yes, everybody has the same assurance gradings that are included within the consortium currently. And again, we're all grappling with different risks, so it's really difficult to compare and contrast. We do have some substantials in other councils. We do have some more limiteds in other councils. It just depends on the control framework in year, and there's lots of different variables. But if you're pushing me to kind of say whether I think North Norfolk in comparison to the others is in a good place, I would say, you know, yes, overall, when we look at the opinion, one area has been raised as a limited, but actually the rest of them are all positive assurance gradings. Thank you, Chair. So this summarises all of the work for 2021-22, and it allows me to consider not just the assurance gradings that was given for each of the audits, but also the progress in terms of completing the recommendations we raised through follow-up. And it allows me to update the audit committee on where I feel we are in terms of progress, but also performance. So we've got some KPIs that we use to manage the performance of the contractor. So this report just kind of summarises the whole internal audit service for that year and gives you an overview of our points that we need to raise. So an important section to this report is on page 63 at 2.2, and it's titled The Opinion Itself. You'll see that overall, in relation to governance, risk management and control at the council, I've determined that this would be a reasonable, which is a positive opinion. It's encouraging to note that of the 14 pieces of work that we've carried out throughout the year. 13 of those have resulted in a positive assurance grading. And just following on from the chair's point there, we have had 3 areas that have concluded with a substantial, not in the last report, but throughout the year. Those were accounts receivable, account services and customer services. We have raised 1 limited assurance report for counter fraud and corruption. And that we recommend that the points raised from that review are added to the annual governance statement until they are complete. So we just track those through, make sure that they're complete before they're removed. We do think that they need to be referenced. If we move on to 3.4, I've provided a summary of follow-up. So those audit recommendations that are outstanding that haven't been completed within the time frame originally allocated. And you can see the position there. In Appendix 3 and Appendix 4, it goes into a little bit more detail about overall how many are outstanding across the years, and also provides an update from management if any are outstanding at year end. At 3.5, you'll see the issues that I recommend are added to the annual governance statement around the counter fraud and corruption. And then section 5.1 onwards goes into the quality assurance and improvement programme, which is the way that the internal audit function assesses how effective it is in line with the standards that we adhere to. Section 2, as I kind of briefly outlined, gives you 5.2 on page 66, gives you the performance indicator outcomes. So I think I mentioned at the start with the progress report, we have struggled this year to complete all the work in line with the boundaries of the KPIs. You can see there 36% of reports were delivered on time 10 days after quarter end, which is our standard. We have managed to recover in time for year end and in time for this committee, but I think we do need to work on that going forward. We've just got through the procurement exercise. We'll continue our relationship with TIA, and as a result of that, I have strengthened the KPIs around timeliness. So we will be able to monitor that much more carefully. But yeah, I think we're just still feeling the effects of catching up from the last couple of years. But I am incredibly happy that we've been able to at least complete the work we set out originally to do. Page 68, Appendix 1 gives you just an overall picture in a table form of the work that we've carried out. Appendix 2, the assurance chart, shows you the gradings that we've given in each area over a number of years. So that can be quite useful for the committee to kind of compare the control framework and the improvements in some of the areas. And then Appendix 3, page 73, is your overall internal audit recommendations, those that are outstanding. You'll be able to see from the column on the left-hand side that we have had quite a few completed this time. Management have been working very hard with us to close some of these down. I would still urge us to work on those historical 1920 ones, the Section 106 agreements, planning and development. But as you'll see from the latter appendix, there is explanations provided by the responsible officer there. So normally we have a chat about those, and I'm happy to take any of your questions about the report overall. Thank you.
Anybody want to challenge anything? Saul, please.
It's just on the Appendix 2, the assurance chart. So where there are areas such as corporate health and safety and economic growth where there's nothing recorded, why is there nothing recorded? Are they simply areas you're just not looking at, and therefore they need to come off that appendix?
We've left them on because they still represent part of the control framework. I think if we did a comparison of this piece of information with the strategic plan, you'd be able to see that we've booked that in for at least the next 3 years. But it is on a risk basis. So if there's not a significant risk highlighted during planning, we wouldn't add it to the plan. But I think if we compared the two, you should see some of those added back in.
And sorry, have you solely finished?
Yes, I was just thinking of sort of economic growth and risks around that going forward. There seems to be quite a number of risks around the economy at the moment. So whether that's something that factors in.
Yes, thank you. That X that you've got in 22-23 means that we are intending to look at it for this year.
All right, okay, thank you. Andrew, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. It's just a bit of a nerdy point for you, to be honest, on page 71. In the box that says development management planning, section 106 agreement, community infrastructure levy. I take it that this is a standard template because we don't have a community infrastructure levy in North Norfolk.
Thank you for pointing that out. I will amend it going forward.
Anybody else? Any other questions for Faye on this one? Okay, this is the annual report. So we are asked to give, and the recommendations are receive and consider the content of the annual report and the opinion of the head of the internal audit. Note that the regional audit opinion has been given. Note that the opinions expressed together with significant matters, and to note the conclusions of the review and effectiveness of the internal audit. Are we all content with that? We don't need a vote. That's fine. Okay. Do we need a vote?
It would be helpful to have a vote, certainly for the first one that you received.
Okay. Can I have a proposer then for the receiving and considering the contents of the annual report and the opinion of the head of the internal audit? Can I have a proposer, please? Thank you, Liz. Seconder. Saul, and a show of hands, please, on that. That's unanimous. Okay, thank you. I think you can have a rest now. All right, item number 9, agenda item is the local code of corporate governance and the annual conference. Chief Executive will take this one, please.
Thanks, Chairman. Good afternoon, members. This report summarises the Council's response to the local code of corporate governance and the annual governance statement for 2021-22. The document at Appendix A reflects good practice in terms of the framework developed by CIPFA and Solace and demonstrates the Council's performance and actions against each of those headline objectives and statements of intent. And then attached Appendix B details the Council's local annual governance statement that is required to be signed by myself and the leader of the Council. I'm happy to take any questions on either Appendix A or B. What I would say in respect of Appendix B is that this is put together by each head of each assistant director and the directors, as well as myself, identifying answering a series of templated questions around the Council's compliance with a series of statements. Those statements are provided to Helen Thomas, Performance and Policy Manager, and she then pulls together those areas and shows where the Council has strengths and weaknesses under each of those headings. In addressing the points raised by the head of internal audit, the document details how the Council has considered a range of governance issues and its response to that around risk management, training development needs, partnerships, and has detailed some of those key messages out of the head of internal audit's annual report. So at pages 128 and 129, some of those issues are detailed, and specifically in respect of the counter fraud, corruption and bribery policy. There's reference to that in paragraph 4.29, and again at in the table on 134 at 5.7. And I appreciate that's the next item on the agenda, but that details that the limited assurance given across the consortium as a whole, and that work would be undertaken to develop our risk approach to the management of fraud going forward, and that's the substantive item on the agenda next. So I commend this document to you. Both myself and the leader of the Council have been involved in its development and are happy to sign it, subject to any questions or points of clarification that the committee might have this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anybody got any? Saul, I'll start there, please.
Thank you. Thanks for this, Steve. Excellent document. It's just, I'm sorry to be a pedant, but just on the very first line of Appendix A, well, the first and second line, when we start off a document and we say with a population of over 104,000, that always strikes me as, well, my question is, well, what is it over 104,000? Is it 150,000, 110? Is there any way we can just tighten that sort of thing up? For example, maybe the figure that was given in the last census, for example. It's just a personal thing that always kind of annoys me a bit when we say over a certain number and we're not sure quite what that is. It's quite indeterminate. Yeah, thank you.
I think that might be a matter of personal choice. Obviously, the population of the council's area it serves does probably almost certainly increase over time, given that we're a popular area. And there's obviously dynamics within this district that means with the number of second homes and the large numbers of tourists that we see at any time during the year is just intended to be illustrative. But I'm happy to reflect on what you've said, Councillor Penfold.
Thank you very much. Because we do say live, so I'm assuming that's living. We're not talking about visitors to the district. We're talking about population.
That is the resident.
That's the resident population.
Yes, yeah.
So we should be able to pick that up from the last census, I would have thought.
Well, the last census at the present time is 2011. So there are obviously mid-year estimates that are updated. The 2021 census, the first release is due in the next few weeks, and that will be very headline figures in terms of population at that time. But yes, at the moment we're based on mid-year estimates, and I think the most reliable mid-year estimate is from 2020.
Perhaps once we know the figures from the 2021, perhaps we can. Anyway, sorry, don't wish to labour the point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else got any questions, Chief Executive? Well. Sorry. Oh, sorry. My apologies. Sorry.
That's right. Mine's a thank you, actually, because I think there's obviously a huge amount of work goes into this. But from a councillor who's been coming in, and this is relatively new coming through BRAC, I have found this really, really useful to see how much is being done and achieved, but also how everything intermeshes together.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's probably a document that we can make far more use of for councillors as well as members of the public. It's actually surprisingly interesting read in places.
It certainly is.
So it's just, it's a thank you, because, it was quite an eye-opener reading it.
Okay, thank you. I have no more questions. Okay, we are asked to review and approve the annual governance statement along with the updated local code of corporate governance. Can I have a proposer, please? Councillor Budikofer, seconder, Councillor Braithwaite, and a show of hands, please, those in favour. That's unanimous. Thank you very much. Okay, agenda item number 10 is the update on the fraud policy and the fraud risk assessment. Who is going to? You're going to do that again? Okay, fine, thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. So the recommendations which Faye outlined to you in terms of the limited assurance across the consortium for fraud and corruption, and the question then that Councillor Cushing asked in terms of the authority's response to those series of recommendations. This item seeks to address those recommendations that are made within that document. The document asks the authority to reflect on both internal and external sources of fraud to the authority. So that does include benefits payments, single person discount for council tax, the issues of potential fraud as identified through the payment of COVID grants and hardship and assistance payments. And then obviously conduct of both officers and members such as the receipt of hospitality or gifts in the determination of planning applications, any fraud built into claiming of expenses and inappropriate relationships. And so the recommendations of the review asks us to reflect on the robustness of our internal controls, awareness of the potential risk of fraud in terms of the whole range of services that we provide, and how there is a reporting framework through a whistleblowing policy and the National Fraud Initiative relationships with the DWP and central government in terms of the sharing of data, particularly around benefit fraud, single person council tax discount, cross-referencing with National Insurance Database, and the issues with HMRC, and indeed our own electoral register in terms of cross-matching the council tax discount, for example. So historically, I think that the policy and the appendices were recently discussed by the corporate leadership team, particularly the recommendation or suggestion that the council looked at whether it had appropriate resources to manage, identify, manage and mitigate the potential risks of fraud across those range of activities that I've just described. And it was quite a challenging ask, I think, of corporate leadership team at a time of increasing pressures on local authority budgets, because historically district councils did have fraud teams, and this authority had a fraud team of 3 officers until April 2015, when that resource transferred into the DWP and the staff were 2P'd. And so, since that time, we haven't had a dedicated fraud resource. The checks and balances that are in place in terms of consideration and appraisal of benefit applications, the request for single person council tax discounts, Section 39 grants in terms of small business rate relief, they all have checks in terms of those processes and procedures which the authority employs, and staff in the revenues and benefits teams are briefed and trained in terms of identifying risks and managing risks of fraud, such that it's believed that our exposure is relatively small but not totally eliminated. And so therefore, if the authority is now to be asked to consider a dedicated fraud resource moving forward, that would need to be costed, it would need to be reflected in the council tax and the council's base budget. And there is no clear business case in existence around those external sources of fraud that would allow us to quantify whether that investment would represent value for money at this time. And so the position of corporate leadership team in discussing the report was that we would instigate a programme of more robust training for all staff within revenues and benefits, and the people services team, who are increasingly dealing with cost of living and hardship grants, as was recently approved by Cabinet at its meeting on the 6th of June, that we would ask managers within those services to give greater consideration to the risk of a potential fraud and how that would be identified and action taken to either minimise and or prosecute in where those circumstances were clearly established, and that we would continue to develop our approach to data sharing across our data sets, particularly the electoral register and the council tax registration scheme for single council tax benefits. But because of our profile of population, where most of our single person discounts are single people in older age groups, the level of risk relative to young people forming and breaking up relationships, students, or a high turnover of young people, the risk here is considered less than in some other local authority areas. So the position of CLT was that we would propose monitoring those issues of levels of fraud, instigate more training for the next 12 months, and then review formally whether we needed to identify a specific resource, and at that time bring a business case as necessary so that it could be included within any future budget approved by the council, because obviously we haven't got that headroom currently in the 2022-23 budget. And I discussed that position with Faye, and she advised, but she can comment further, that she was comfortable with that as a measure for the next 12 months, so we could assess what the business need was. In terms of our internal processes for fraudulent claims of expenses and issues of hospitality, we've got a very integrated, and it has been strengthened, personnel HR system around payroll. Payroll has been subject to audits and has always fared very favourably here in terms of those systems and processes that are in place. We obviously have the monitoring officer maintains a register of gifts, hospitality for declaration, both for staff and elected members. And it's very short in terms of what is deemed appropriate in terms of acceptance of gifts or hospitality. And the internal audit, head of internal audit, has led a review and strengthening of the council's whistleblowing policy over the last 12 months, such that it is believed that in terms of sources of internal fraud, the council's systems and processes are robust and fit for purpose moving forward. So the covering report details those actions. There is then in terms of the strategic responsibility that Faye outlined that this committee has, there is then a new counter-fraud, corruption and bribery policy that is drafted and is presented to you in terms of your strategic oversight. There is then at Appendix 2 detailed of any investigation procedures which the authority would deploy in the investigation of any potential fraud. There is then Appendix 3, a corporate counter-fraud awareness action plan. These summarise on the left-hand side the principal fraud risks that the authority might face, and then there's detailed actions and the potential outcomes. And then finally, there is a fraud risk assessment which details the level of risk and actions that we would take at a service level in order to minimise those risks, and that applies a RAG rating system, so red, amber and green. Some of those I have similarly discussed these issues with Faye, and some of those issues might be subjective. And so I'm happy to answer any questions around the red, amber and green classifications. In that the ones I particularly have discussed was around the payroll fraud relative to potentially fraudulent insurance claims where members of the public or possibly council staff or employees or contractors might experience an accident at work or something like that and may seek to claim against the authority. And that's a relatively small risk, but it's my belief that recruitment fraud and potential of ghost employees, payroll fraud in an organisation of this size, rather than a much larger organisation with thousands of employees, would be deemed to be an amber risk. But the conversation I had with Faye was that, you know, there's a degree of subjectivity around those classifications, and that's something that she's happy to have a further conversation with us about moving forward. So I hope that is helpful in outlining to you the action taken by the authority in response to the recommendations within the limited assurance consortium-wide review of corporate risk and fraud, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, let's open the floor. Councillor Cushing, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple of questions, if I may. Can you explain what, if any, sort of engagement is undertaken by this authority with other lower tier authorities? For example, there are 6 others in Norfolk in order to generate learnings or any sort of local government authorities in order to find sort of, if you like, this cross-fertilization in terms of knowledge and things and current affairs that may be happening, or things that may be happening?
Yes, I'm happy, of course, to answer that. So I think what this consortium-wide review has established is that there is learning to be and gaps to be closed across the consortium as a whole. Prior to COVID, there was some initial conversations between the district and the county council about whether there could be a centralised fraud team, not dissimilar to the approach to the consortium for internal audit, but those discussions were not progressed or have been parked because of the focus on COVID, and that is something that could be resurrected.
And if I may have a second, thank you for that, that's fine. Second question is really around the training, because I noticed something on page, what are you actually used the term robust training? I mean, is there standard annual training on this? When you say robust training, what sort of level of training do you have? Is there something that is on an ongoing basis with staff that has to make sure they're always refreshed in terms of their knowledge?
So I think in terms of induction, and there is a turnover of staff, it is one of our largest teams, revenues and benefits. They're two of the largest teams within the authority. So there is a turnover of staff in those roles. So new staff are onboarded and undertake training. There hasn't been any refresher training because it is across the economy as a whole. Many of those issues have been delayed and deferred because of COVID. So that is something that the HR manager has been asked to address during the remainder of this calendar year.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks again, Steve, for an excellent document. A lot of work in there. Just around the risk categories that you mentioned, page 169, and then following on Appendix C. So how you arrive at those, the red, amber, and green, with a degree of subjectivity. So are those the various shadings there, the various colours, are they based upon previous experience that we've had of types of fraud like that within the authority, or likelihood of occurrence, or level of impact of that occurrence, if you see what I mean?
A combination,
or a combination
of all three.
Right. Okay. So we have seen those that are shaded red, that those things have cropped up in the past, and we have been affected by them as an authority.
Well, I think the council tax and business rate fraud, I think I addressed in my introductory comments, the figures that are quoted there, the £28.9 million, that's a loss nationally across England. So, in terms of assessing our risk and our context, because of our aged population, I think it is less likely that we would have fraud of any significant scale from that group. And many of our small businesses are eligible for business rate relief because of the nature of our economy. It's an assessment of that national risk and how that would be applied locally, and the extent to which we have any significant issues. Within the covering report, forgive me. There is a reference to how many times you've made referrals into the National Fraud Initiative Partnership. I can't find it at the present time, but the number of incidents were very small, and it needs to be seen in that context.
Yeah, regarding on page 169, risk area 3, do we have any evidence? I mean, there has been nationally well publicized cases of COVID grant fraud. Do we have any cases in North Norfolk that we know of?
I think the issue at a national level is on the COVID business loans and whether people applied and whether there was a benefit, whether those businesses existed. Don't think it was so much around the business grant scheme because we had to make assessments against the business rate base. But there was a national business continuity or recovery loan scheme, and I believe at a national level, that's where the greatest risk of fraud has been identified.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, just following on from Councillor Bathwaite, I'm just looking at the National Fraud Initiative, paragraph 5 on page 168. And I think it says above, or it reminds everybody that the council has won an award for administering nearly £130 million of business grants. Are we to infer from the granting of the award that we are totally confident that the systems we've put in place to identify this new area of opportunity to fraudsters are perfectly adequate, that we're happy with that, that the sharing of information with other public bodies is robust and working well?
So a recognition that we got from the Public Finance Award and the comments from the government and our success under the COVID additional recovery grant scheme was based on our performance in terms of speed and effectiveness of payment. All local authorities are now subject to ongoing reporting of fraud and expenditure against those lists and payments, and I'm not aware of any significant issues of error or recovery from North Norfolk. The metrics that I was talking about earlier in those others are detailed at page 167. In terms of paragraph 3.7 particularly shows that over a 12-month period, we only made 9 referrals to the Single Fraud Investigation Service, and they only advised us of £3,500 of housing benefit fraud. So, you know, I think it's on those basis that we need to make an assessment as to how much dedicated officer resource we put into this sort of activity beyond a good and robust program of training, staff awareness, and those systems and processes.
Going back to some of those processes, Steve, I'm looking at section 4, the conducting investigations section on page 161.
Yep.
And it sort of looks, it's in appendix 2 for anyone who's looking. It looks to me as if, and I can understand why, the sort of heads of service, etc., will be passing it on to audit or to monitoring officer for investigations to be carried out. If we're looking at this as part of a review of what's needed, will that also take into account the extra pressures that's going to place on sort of phase team and the monitoring officer rather than a separate fraud team as such? Are we looking at that way, or are we looking more globally?
Yeah, that's a great point to make, but this has always been the case that you would be able to call on us for that support, and thankfully, you know, it doesn't represent a huge resource burden on the internal audit service, but yeah, that can also be factored into the fraud work and the resources required to cover that point. So we are here, we can be used for investigations on a case-by-case basis.
So in the last 2 years, obviously there was one incident in terms of the loss of cash from the cash office, which we did ask internal audit to undertake an investigation on. And so it's those rare incidences that we would draw upon that resource and experience.
Thank you.
I think, as you can see, there's been a lot of work done to address the findings raised in the audit report, and that is fantastic. I totally understand, the need for a proper business case if you're going to be, putting extra resource in this area. All I would say is that I just think this needs continuous review. We need to keep on top of it, keep the momentum going. And I think you as audit committee members are going to be really key in that going forward. So, yeah, thank you.
That's good. Thank you very much for that. Around the table, nothing else. Okay. Right. There's a couple of points here. We're asked to approve the update fraud and anti-corruption policy. So I think we need a vote on that. If we could have a proposer for that, please. Christopher, can I have a seconder, please? Pierre, and a show of hands, please, for that. That is unanimous. And then the other ones is to note the associated fraud risk assessments, to note the recommended improvement actions, and to note the progress on other actions. I think we've noted those. Thank you very much. Okay. Agenda item 11. Again, looks like it's Chief Executive. Don't argue. One of you, please.
Well, we weren't arguing. So this is a corporate. This is a quarterly report, and I've been assisted in its compilation by Helen, who is here this afternoon. So this talks about both the strategic and operational risks that face the authority in a local, national and global context. So obviously there are some significant issues at a global level in terms of the war in Ukraine, the impact that is having on global fuel prices, food stability, supply stability, cost of living, and all of those pressures, which will touch on the council services and the support that we provide to local people as a service provider, but also in terms of the council being an employer. There is significant inflation within the UK economy at the present time, and we are seeing that carry forward into our procurement, particularly of construction and related contracts. Obviously, in terms of the instruments that the government has nationally, or the Bank of England has, the Monetary Policy Committee, obviously we are now seeing a beginning of a rise of interest rates after a prolonged period of historically low rates. That may have some positive movement for the authority in terms of interest returns on its investments, but that isn't going to make up for the cost pressures that we face in inflationary terms. There are a series of other issues which are identified in terms of national government policy as it relates to the county deals, the Levelling Up White Paper and the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, which we obviously need to manage and respond to. There are extra pressures in terms of resources, in terms of providing our support to our community. So just in terms of the £150 energy rebate scheme, your revenues team have paid out over 32,000 payments to date, 90% of eligible people, and that is within a period of 12 weeks of that announcement being made by government and implementation of a new software system to allow those payments to take place. And that is unknown work. You know, when we sat and spoke about the council's budget at the end of February for this period of time, that was an unknown ask of government upon local government to respond. So again, those issues are summarised and highlighted within the document. And then there are some reputational and risk elements around some of the front-facing services the authority provides, and is some of the creative activity it's undertaking, such as the project-related risks associated with the delivery of the North Walsham Heritage Action Zone. For instance, in terms of, you know, are there unforeseens? Do we dig up the road and there's a unknown cellar and that needs to be bridged, or something of that nature? All of which, you know, can come can be experienced in town centre renewal type schemes. So those issues are summarised in the document. And then graphically, it shows what those risks are and whether there's a positive or negative direction of travel in the subsequent in-phase graphic representations, which are detailed within the report. But I'm happy to take any questions if any members have questions on specific risks or issues.
A couple, if I may, please. Page 193, you've got the risk there, CR008, loss of information status, which has a score of a target of 2 and a score of 16. I just wondered if you or Helen knows how, obviously if it's 4, then if it's, that means it must be a risk likelihood of 4 and a risk consequence of 4 in order to get up to 16. So why is there such a high likelihood of that risk potentially?
Sorry, could you repeat the code of the risk?
Yes, it's CR008. I suppose my subsequent question is what has been done to mitigate that risk?
Yes, historically, the score has been, the targeted score has been to achieve 2.2. That is the default that we set for our corporate and strategic risk, to try to get to 2.2. Sometimes we have to set a higher target because it's not achievable to get down to 2.2. But unfortunately, because of the cyber attack threat, the actual risk of that happening has gone up considerably this year. That's why that score has gone up over the last 6 months.
So if I may, I suppose the follow on from that, if that risk is increasing considerably, what is the council doing in order to fend that risk off then? Whether you or the chief executive?
So we do have a good public sector network accreditation, but I can ask for a written response from the head of IT in respect to that question, if I may.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, just starts with something that sort of stands out and leaps out from the page as something that's only a bit of a concern, which wasn't mentioned in your summary. If I may have a second question, which I just all around, if I can go to really one for the chief executive, which is SR005, which is around the nutrient neutrality, which again was not mentioned in the summary, but I think all of us are probably fairly aware of what that risk actually is. But clearly, that is, if of all the risks that the council is facing at the moment, that is obviously one of the biggest, I would have thought, in terms of the impact on our housing, our local plan and building affordable housing. So just wondered if you had any further comments that you could tell us, please.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a significant risk for the authority and other authorities in Norfolk and indeed in England. I think there's some 72 authorities now that are subject to nutrient neutrality restrictions as advised by Natural England. I think the concern is a legitimate one in terms of water quality, but I think the lack of prior notification and discussion with partner local authorities is something that across the local government family concern has been expressed about through representative bodies, district council network, local government association to government, both through Natural England and directly to DEFRA. In terms of it would have an implication in terms of our housing completion numbers and our 5-year land supply, and indeed may pause our programme of submitting the local plan for examination. there is a strong partnership in Norfolk that is of the local planning authorities through the duty to cooperate framework that has engaged Royal Haskonian consultants to undertake some analysis and develop a mitigation strategy and response to the nutrient neutrality instruction by Natural England, which was handed down to local authorities on the 16th of March. I haven't been involved in those discussions myself, and they're being led on behalf of this authority by Martin Fulcher and Philip Rowson. And I think John Toy, as portfolio holder, and others may be involved in those conversations with elected members of other authorities through that duty to cooperate framework. My understanding is that the consultants have been appointed and are intending to provide an initial response to partners in September, and a strategy or mitigation measures will then be developed during the autumn, such that there is a degree of confidence that this matter might be resolved before the end of the calendar year, but I don't think that is guaranteed. I'm happy to confess that IT is not my strongest suite, so I will need to seek advice in that regard from Sean Kelly in terms of the Assistant Director for Organisation Resources and lead for IT, because he knows about these things and I don't, Chair. Oh, Helen's waving, sorry. Absolutely, yes, yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Just to add a little bit of detail on that, I have had some discussions with Sean Kelly and our network manager, and they are very much tied into all the cybercrime information that's coming out from the government and responding robustly to every threat very quickly. But if you would like to get more detail, that would be absolutely fine.
Are there any other? I have one. On page 194, the 8th column down has a question mark. Could someone please tell me what the question is?
Whether it's up to date, I think I'll take that away, Chair. As it's the only question mark there seems to be on those 2 pages. That's fine. Thank you. Might be an oversight, I don't know. I'll come back to you. Oh, sorry, it's the production and approval of the asset management plan.
Page 194.
It's allocated to Renata.
But it's just got a question mark, not a tick. So if we could, you follow that up for me. Thank you.
I'll follow that up, yes.
Okay, thank you. Harry, please.
You alluded to it earlier. It's been said, reported that the Chancellor is looking to lose 11 billion because he did not insure against interest rate rises. Are we, as an authority, equally as exposed?
Well, not to the extent of 11 billion pounds, Councillor, but I don't know. I will need to speak to the Treasury team about that.
Andrew, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just as further information on what the Chief Executive alluded to on nutrient neutrality.
Yeah.
One area of concern which remains to be resolved, and we're hoping that this will come through reasonably timely, is the status of conditional planning applications as opposed to full planning applications on the 16th of March. There is divided legal opinion which came out of the cross-authority meeting that we had last week, which I attended with Councillor Toy, on whether that is caught by the nutrient neutrality embargo or whether it isn't. So hopefully some clarity will come forward on that. If it does, then some planning applications which are conditional and have reserved matters still to be determined may be allowed to continue depending on the outcome. And if that's the case, then at least some planning applications will become live again.
Okay, thank you for that. Yes, Helen.
I can answer quickly that position on the asset management.
Please.
If you'd like me to. Renata had set it as complete back in October 2021. She just hadn't put a RAG status on it, that's all. That's why there's a question mark there. So it has been completed.
Right, so will that be added to the next table?
I'll make sure it is.
Will you please?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Okay, that's acceptable. Okay, we're fine. Thank you very much. We're asked to review and note this report. I think that's okay. We're happy with that. Thank you very much. Item number 12, the exemption certificates, procurement exemption certificate with the monitoring officer, please.
Thank you. Rather than the exemptions being reported just annually, GRAC members decided that they should be reported on a more regular basis, on a quarterly basis. The last 2 quarters provided a nil report, but this time there are 8 exemptions, and they're detailed on page 217. If you have any questions, here I am.
Just, Chair. I was just going to say about the Hardscape Products Limited purchase of stone for church approach. That stone is in place, installed in North Walsham. It's quite visible in 2 of our places. I think the important thing is we had to get on with it because in buying it early, we've actually saved thousands of pounds. So whilst it's a large sum for an exemption certificate, it has saved this council a considerable sum of money.
I think, Council, we were all quite aware of how rare that is, that we did need to get it, and with the current situation on supplies. So I think that's probably why nobody has raised any query about that thing, but thank you.
And can I also assure you, Chairman, it is good quality stone, unlike the last stuff that was laid in church.
We won't talk about that. Thank you very much. Okay, so the exemption certificates we are asked to review and note if we have no questions. Fine, thank you very much. We move on to agenda item 13. Which is the Governance Risk and Audit Committee's outcomes and action list. Everything is sort of listed. I note Matt in his absence, and we wish you well soon, Matt. I know you're listening. Has completed on that. I have no questions on any of that. We are just noting it. Very happy with that one. Thank you very much. Agenda item 14. Again, is the annual work programme. We have a next GRAC meeting is booked for the 12th of July, which we at the moment are leaving open, but it may have to be changed, reviewed, discussed.
It's scheduled in for the 12th of July, but we will advise members if we need to move that. We may need to move it later that month, or we may need to wait till September. But and if I could just add quickly, members will notice that there's a to be confirmed for today for the external audit letter. So Mark Hodgson has advised that the infrastructure assets issue has not been resolved. So you remember that was on condition of that issue being resolved. I don't know if Steve wants to add more to that.
This was the very last minute issue raised regarding the completion of the 2019-2020 final accounts at a national level around the treatment of infrastructure assets. It's largely to do with the value and depreciation of road and capital assets of that nature generally. But for North Norfolk District Council, it relates to the repair, maintenance, and any subsequent capital investment in coast defences and the extent to which they deteriorate, and if within a period of 20 years, I think it was, that further investment is made, how the residual value of the previous investment is accounted for. And that is still unresolved with SIPFA at a national level.
Thank
Just
you for that.
finally wanted to say that I've obviously picked up from the actions earlier on around the annual action plan and the annual review for progress on combating fraud. So we'll build that in to the
Okay.
programme going forward. So you'll see that reflected in the next one that's coming up.
Okay, that's fine. And as I say, 12th of July is penciled in the diary. I think the title of external audit plan might well explain why we might be delaying it a little bit and putting it off. So it is a time issue on that one. That one is for us to note. I have no other items, no exclusion of the press or public. And I'll formally close the meeting at 3:20. Thank you very much.